Right now, outside one particular window on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the city is doing what it always does. Buses, sirens, food carts, thousands of strangers moving through the same few blocks every hour. It is one of the most crowded places on the planet. 16 floors up, behind a locked door in a public housing apartment, 7 children are listening to all of it and touching almost none of it. 6 brothers and 1 sister. For most of their childhoods, they will not walk down that street, ride that subway, or stand in that crowd. The only key to the front door belongs to their father, and he keeps it on him. What these children know about the world outside comes almost entirely from a television set and a wall of movie tapes. And then, on an ordinary day in the winter of 2010, one of the brothers pulls a mask down over his face, crosses the room to that locked door, and does the single thing the entire household was built to prevent. He opens it, and he walks out into the city. So how does that even happen? How do 7 kids grow up almost completely invisible inside a city of 8 million people, in an apartment surrounded by neighbors, in a building packed with other families? And then the harder question, the one this whole story turns on. Why would a father decide that the door had to stay shut, that the street 16 floors below was so dangerous his own children could not be allowed to set foot on it? The answer runs straight through that wall of movie tapes, and it turns out to be stranger than the isolation itself. To understand the apartment, you have to start somewhere that looks nothing like it. In the late 1980s, a young woman from the American Midwest was traveling in Peru, hiking the trail up to Machu Picchu. Her name was Suzanne. She was from Michigan, and by every account, she was the kind of person who wanted to see the world, rather than be afraid of it. On that trail, she met a Peruvian man named Oscar Angulo. They fell in love fast. They traveled together through the United States, spent time around the Hare Krishna movement, and eventually landed in New York City, which is where the children started arriving through the 1990s. And there is a cruel irony built into that beginning, one worth sitting with for a second. The 2 people who started this family were not shut-ins. They met outdoors, on a mountain trail, thousands of miles from home, both of them out in the world on purpose. Suzanne had gone looking for something bigger than the town she grew up in. Oscar was a long way from Peru. Whatever else you want to say about how this story ends, it started with 2 people who went out looking for the world and found each other doing it. 2 travelers on a trail in the Andes, thousands of miles from anything familiar. Which makes what came next even harder to explain. Because somewhere between that mountain and that apartment, Oscar's view of the world turned into something much darker, and he decided that the freedom he had used to go find his own wife was the exact thing his children could never be trusted with. Oscar had ideas about how these children would be raised, and the names came first. He was drawn to Hare Krishna belief, and he gave every child a Sanskrit name. The daughter, the oldest, he named Vishnu. The sons he named Bhagavan, Govinda, Narayana, Mukunda, Krishna, and Jagadisa. He decided their hair would never be cut, so the boys grew it long and dark, down past their shoulders, all the way down their backs. If you had passed them on the street in those early years, you would have remembered them. 7 kids with matching black hair, moving as one unit, always together. The thing is, almost nobody did pass them on the street, because by the time the family was complete, Oscar had already made the decision that would define all of their lives. The children were not going to be part of the world out there. The world out there was going to be kept on the other side of the door. And this is where a strict household turns into something that no longer fits the word strict. Oscar held the only key to the apartment, not a spare hidden in a drawer, not one the mother could grab on her way out. One key, and it stayed with him. The children could not leave on their own, ever. When they did go outside, it was rare, it was brief, and it was under his supervision. The family later described the math of it, and the math is the part that stops you. In a good year, they might go out around 9 times. There was a year, at least one, when they did not go outside at all. Not once. 12 months on the 16th floor, watching the city through a window they were not allowed to walk into. And remember where this was happening. Not on some remote farm, not in a cabin in the woods where cutting yourself off at least makes a kind of practical sense. This was a public housing block on the Lower East Side, one apartment among hundreds, with neighbors on every side and an entire city pressed right up against the windows. There were people living a few feet away through the walls who had no real idea that 7 children were growing up sealed inside. The Angulos were not hidden out in some wilderness. They were hidden in plain sight, in the middle of everything, which is somehow harder to wrap your head around. A whole family can vanish inside a crowd of 8 million people, as long as one person is willing to keep the door shut and hold the only key. Suzanne homeschooled all 7 of them, because they never set foot in a classroom. The family lived on public assistance. Oscar did not work, and he was open about the fact that he did not intend to. He talked about not wanting to be a slave to society, about refusing to plug himself into a system he distrusted. So the money that fed 9 people came through the state and through Suzanne, and the days were spent inside. And the rule was always the same: you do not go out there. Now, plenty of parents are protective. Plenty of parents are strict about the city, about strangers, about who their kids talk to. But this was well past caution. This was a father who looked at one of the most alive cities on earth, decided it was nothing but a threat, and sealed his children away from it for years at a time. And the obvious question is why? What did he think was out there? Before we get to what Oscar believed, you need to understand what the children did all day, because it is the key to everything that happens later. With the outside world switched off, one thing filled the space it left behind: movies. The apartment held an enormous collection of films, thousands of them, tapes and discs stacked on shelves and in boxes. By the family's own count, the number ran as high as 5,000. And these films were not background noise for the kids. They were their school, their travel, their crowd scenes, their version of going anywhere. If you have never been to a restaurant, a movie shows you what a restaurant is. If you have never seen the ocean, or an airport, or a bar fight, or 2 strangers falling in love, the screen is where all of it happens. For the Angulo children, nearly every idea they had about how people out there talk, argue, dress, move, and behave came off that screen. They were learning the entire outside world secondhand, in the dark, from a wall of tapes their father had chosen. And it went deeper than facts about the world. Through those films, the children were absorbing far more than what a subway or a diner or a beach looked like. They were picking up how people feel things, or at least how actors perform feeling things. How you show anger, how you fall in love, how you grieve, how you fight, how you say goodbye. When your entire sense of other human beings comes off a screen, then movie logic quietly becomes your logic. A birthday, an argument, a first kiss, all of it arrives already shaped like a scene you have watched 100 times. And that is a much stranger, much lonelier kind of education than it sounds at first. These children were building their entire sense of how human beings behave out of performances on a screen, with almost nothing real to check any of it against. And notice the contradiction sitting right in the middle of that. A father who decided the real city was too dangerous to touch filled his home with its most violent, most intense stories. Gangster films, horror films, crime films full of guns and blood and men doing terrible things to each other. He kept his children away from a sidewalk, and he handed them Reservoir Dogs, and Halloween, and Pulp Fiction, and No Country for Old Men. The real street downstairs was forbidden, but its most violent movie version played in the apartment on a loop. Hold on to that, because it is going to matter more than almost anything else in this story. It is worth naming what those films actually were, because they were not gentle. Reservoir Dogs is a movie about a robbery gone wrong, full of men in suits screaming and bleeding on a warehouse floor. Halloween is about a masked man who kills people in a quiet suburb. No Country for Old Men is one of the most frightening films about violence ever made in this country. These are not the movies you would reach for if your whole goal was to keep children innocent and calm. But they were the films these brothers watched until they had them memorized cold, and there is something almost unbearable in that. A father terrified of the real violence of the real city let his children live, every single day, inside the most brutal stories Hollywood ever told, because those at least stayed safely on the far side of a screen. So what was Oscar actually afraid of? Here we have to be careful, because it is easy to turn a man like this into a cartoon, and the truth from the film and from interviews is more specific than that. In his own telling, Oscar framed the isolation as protection. He looked at New York and saw drugs, crime, danger, corruption, a place that would swallow his children and change them into something he did not want them to be. He seemed to believe that if he could just keep them inside, keep them pure, keep them away from all of it. He was saving them. That is the version where he is the guardian at the gate. His sons, later, described a different feeling from the inside. They described control. They described fear. They described a father whose word was the only law in the house, and whose drinking made him harder to live with and harder to predict. Both of those things live in the documentary side by side, the stated reason and the felt reality. And this video is not going to pretend to know the inside of Oscar Angulo's mind. What we can say plainly is this: whatever he believed he was protecting them from, the method was total. The door stayed locked, and childhood happened on the inside of it. There is one more piece of Oscar worth putting on the table, because his sons are the ones who put it there. In the film, they describe a father who was controlling and domineering, whose moods ran the entire household, and whose drinking made the apartment tense, and at times, frightening. Oscar carried a grand sense of himself and his role. He talked about the outside world as beneath him, about ordinary work as a kind of slavery he refused to accept, about his own family as something he alone was meant to guide and shape. You can hear, in the way he speaks, a man who needed to sit at the center of a world he could control completely. And the only way to keep a world that controllable is to make it very, very small. 16 floors up, behind one locked door, he had built exactly that. A universe of 9 people, where he held the only key, in more ways than one. Now here is where the story stops being only sad and starts being genuinely strange, in a way you may not see coming, because the brothers did something with those thousands of films that almost nobody would predict. They started to rebuild them. Somewhere in all those hours in the dark, watching the same movies over and over, they began to reenact them. Not loosely, not for a laugh. They would take a film they loved, and they would recreate it, line for line, shot for shot, as exactly as 6 kids in an apartment possibly could. They wrote the scripts out by hand. If they did not already have the entire movie memorized, and often they did, they would sit and transcribe the dialogue into notebooks, page after page, until they had the whole screenplay copied out in pencil. That work alone could take weeks. Think about the patience that takes. Not a weekend project, not a school assignment you can half finish and forget. These were kids who would spend weeks copying a 2-hour movie out by hand, word for word, and then spend more weeks building everything they needed to stage it, and then perform the whole thing, and then start again with a different film. This was the main work of their lives. It was how they marked time. A finished reenactment was probably the biggest event that could happen in a given month, bigger than any holiday, because it was the one part of their world they built completely themselves, out of nothing, on their own terms, with no permission required. Then came the props, and this is the detail that tells you how much it meant to them. They had no money and no supplies, so they built everything out of what the apartment held: cereal boxes, cardboard, paper, tape, old yoga mats. Out of that, they made costumes and weapons and masks. They made a Batman suit. They made the pale, blank Halloween mask. They made suits and ties to become the men in Reservoir Dogs, all of them in black, walking through the apartment in slow motion like the movie they had watched 100 times. And then they filmed it. They performed these movies for each other, and for their own camera, inside 4 bedrooms, with the real city they were copying sealed away on the far side of the wall. It would be easy to file that away as a strange, sweet hobby, a way to pass the time for kids who had nothing else. But watch what it actually was, because this is the hinge the entire story swings on. Oscar had put that screen in front of his children to replace the world. The movies were supposed to be the substitute, the thing that made the real city unnecessary, the wall that kept them content on the inside. And instead, without him ever intending it, that screen became the one thing that taught them the world was real, that it was out there, and that it was full of things worth wanting. Every time they memorized a script, they were learning how people out there speak to each other. Every time they built a costume and became a character, they were rehearsing how to be a person in a world they had never been allowed to enter. The movies were not keeping them inside. The movies were quietly, frame by frame, teaching them how to leave. Without ever meaning to, their father had handed them the one thing that could eventually get them out. And once you see it that way, the rest of the story reads completely differently. These were not passive kids waiting to be rescued. They were spending years, whether they knew it or not, studying the exact thing their father was hiding from them. So the real question was never whether one of them would eventually open that door. The real question was which one, and when, and what would finally push him to do it. The answer was Mukunda, and the year was 2010. He was 15 years old. And on a day in that winter, for reasons that were partly just the ordinary pressure of being a teenager who cannot take it anymore, he did the forbidden thing. He left the apartment alone, without his father, without permission, and he walked out into the neighborhood by himself. But he did not walk out as himself. He put on a mask first. In the widely reported version of that day, it was a mask straight out of one of the movies that had raised him. The pale, expressionless face from Halloween. The Michael Myers mask. Think about what that means for a second. The first time this boy stepped into the real world on his own terms, he did it wearing the face of a horror movie, because a horror movie was the closest thing he had to armor. The films were his only language for the outside, so of course he reached for one when he finally crossed into it. It did not go smoothly, and honestly, how could it? A teenager in a mask, wandering a Manhattan neighborhood alone, is going to get noticed. People were alarmed. The police got involved. And Mukunda, a kid who had spent his whole life inside 4 rooms, suddenly found himself pulled into the machinery of the outside world he had only ever seen on a screen. He was taken to Bellevue, the hospital, for a psychiatric evaluation. He was held there for about a week before he came home. From the outside, you could call that a failed escape. He left, it went wrong, and he ended up right back in the apartment he had tried to walk out of. But that is not how these things actually work, and it is not what happened here. Because the other brothers had just watched something they could not unsee. One of them had opened the door and walked into the city, and the sky had not fallen, and he had come back alive, and the world had not destroyed him. The spell that held that apartment together for all those years depended on the door being unthinkable. Mukunda had just made it thinkable. You can almost map the psychology of it. For years, that door had exactly one meaning in that house. It was the line you did not cross, the edge of what was possible, and it held precisely because nobody ever tested it. The moment one brother tested it and came back alive, the door stopped being a law of nature and turned back into just a door, something a person could actually walk through. Mukunda did not free his brothers by giving a speech or winning an argument with their father. He freed them by showing them, with his own body, that the worst thing they had all been raised to fear was survivable. Once they had seen that, the fear that ran the whole house started to lose its hold. And that is the thing about a rule that has never been broken. It looks permanent right up until the moment it isn't. Over the months that followed, the brothers started going outside. Not all at once, not in some dramatic single break, but gradually, one trip at a time. They walked the neighborhood. They rode the subway. They saw the ocean. They went to a movie in an actual theater, which for these particular kids might have been the strangest experience of all. Watching a film the normal way, in a room full of strangers, instead of rebuilding it by hand at home. Everything they had learned secondhand off a screen, they were now touching with their own hands. And they were doing it as a pack, 6 brothers with long dark hair, moving through the city together, exactly the way they had once moved through their reenactments, except now the streets were real. And the list of firsts was staggering, full of the kind of ordinary things most of us cannot even remember doing for the first time, because we were too young when we did them. The first time feeling sand and cold seawater out at the beach. The first time standing in a crowd that was not their own family. The first apple pulled straight off a tree in an orchard, which sounds like nothing until you remember that one of these brothers was nearly grown before he ever got to do it. Every single one of those moments was a scene they had watched other people live, on a screen, for years. Now they were the ones living it, in a real body, in real weather, with the wind and the noise and the strangers all included in the price. The world they had studied so hard finally had a temperature and a smell. Which brings us to the person who made it possible for the rest of us to ever see any of this. In the spring of 2010, not long after the brothers had started venturing out, a young filmmaker named Crystal Moselle was walking down First Avenue in Manhattan, and she saw them. 6 teenage boys with hair down to their waists, all in dark suits and sunglasses, moving fast down the street in a tight group. It was such an unusual sight that she went after them, and she introduced herself, and she told them she made films. For kids whose entire inner life was built out of movies, that was the magic word. They bonded with her almost instantly, over the one thing they knew better than anything else on Earth: cinema. Now, this is the point where a story like this can go wrong, and I want to be clear about it, because the filmmaker is not the hero here, and this is not really her story. Crystal Moselle became the doorway through which the rest of the world finally got to see the Angulo family, but the family is the subject, not her. What she did was earn their trust slowly, over years. She has said that for a long time she did not even understand what she was looking at. She did not know, at first, about the years of confinement, about the locked door, about how deep the isolation had gone. She just knew these were unusual, gentle, film-obsessed kids, and she kept showing up with her camera. Months after that first meeting, they invited her into the apartment, and she kept filming, on and off, for around 4 years. She was working with real limits, and the way she handled them tells you a lot about how sealed this family still was. There were times and places she could not bring her camera, so she gave the brothers a camera of their own and let them shoot when she was not there. And she wove in something the family already had, which is one of the eeriest parts of the whole film. Years earlier, before any outsider was ever going to see it, the Angulos had shot their own home movies inside the apartment. The reenactments, the daily life, the kids performing on the 16th floor. All of it captured on an old camcorder, for an audience of nobody. That footage existed for years inside those walls before the world ever knew the family was there. Moselle put it into the film, and suddenly you are watching a childhood that was never meant to be seen by anyone outside the front door. And that closeness is part of why the film hit people as hard as it did when it finally came out. This was not a case of a director recreating events after the fact, with actors and dramatic lighting and a script. The camcorder footage was the real thing, shot by the family, inside the actual apartment, during the actual years of confinement. You are not watching a polished version of the story. You are watching the story itself, filmed by the children living inside it, for no reason other than that filming was the one thing they truly knew how to do. It gives the whole documentary an unsettling closeness, because there is nothing standing between you and them. You are just there, inside those 4 rooms, watching kids perform movies for a camera in a home nobody outside was ever meant to enter. And while all of this was happening, while the brothers were walking into the city and a filmmaker was slowly getting let in, something was shifting with their mother too, and it is easy to miss how big it is. Suzanne had homeschooled these 7 children for years. She had taught them everything they knew about reading and history and the world. From inside an apartment she also could not freely leave. And here is the detail that reframes her whole situation. Suzanne had a mother of her own, back in Michigan, and she had not spoken to her in decades. She had let herself be cut off from her own family, her own past, the same way her children had been cut off from the city. There is a moment in the documentary where she gets on the phone and speaks to her mother for the first time in all those years, and she lights up like a kid. It is one of the quietest scenes in the film, and one of the most devastating, because it makes you realize how far the isolation actually reached. It had closed over the woman raising them just as completely as it had closed over the kids. So the door opens, the brothers go out, the filmmaker comes in, the mother reaches back toward her own life, and you might expect the story to end there, with a clean escape and a happy ending. But that is not how any of this actually went, and pretending it was would be its own kind of lie. Freedom, for the Angulos, was not a single event. One boy in a mask walking out on a winter afternoon did not fix anything by itself. What came after was slow, and uneven, and complicated, and in some ways it is still going. Think about what these young men were actually facing. They had to learn how to be in the world as teenagers and adults, without ever having been in it as children. How to talk to strangers, how to get a job, how to be around women, around crowds, around all the ordinary friction of a life outside 4 rooms. Some of that came easier than you would think, because in a strange way they had been studying for it their whole lives through the movies. Some of it came much harder. Leaving a place like that apartment is not just walking through a door. It is unlearning the fear that kept the door shut, and that takes far longer than one trip outside. And not everyone in that family was starting from the same place. Their sister, Visnu, the oldest of the 7 children, had been born with a genetic condition called Turner syndrome, which affected her development, and she moved through all of this differently than her brothers did. It is worth pausing on her, because in a story that usually gets told as the tale of 6 filmmaking brothers, she is easy to skip past, and she should not be. She lived the same isolation they did, inside the same locked apartment, for the same years. Whatever freedom came to mean for this family, it had to mean something for her too. And the honest thing to say is that walking out of that apartment did not hand all 7 of these children the same future. It could not. They had started too unequal, and they had already lost too much time. But they did move forward, and where they moved is the part that closes the loop this whole story opened. The brothers went toward film. Of course they did. It was the only world they had ever fully understood, and now they could actually enter it. Govinda went into camera work, becoming a camera assistant, and then working in the camera and electrical departments on real productions, the kind of professional sets he had only ever imagined from the inside of an apartment. Mukunda, the one who walked out first, went toward directing and filmmaking. Narayana, one of the twins, moved toward production work and toward activism, including environmental causes, and now goes by a different name. Bhagavan, the oldest brother, moved toward dance and yoga. Together they started their own production company, so that instead of copying other people's films by hand in a locked apartment, they could make their own out in the open. The children who had rebuilt Hollywood out of cereal boxes were now trying to build it for real. And the world outside was watching now, which is its own kind of vertigo. When the Wolfpack premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January of 2015, it won the top prize in its category, the Grand Jury Prize for a documentary. Sit with the distance covered there. 5 years earlier, Mukunda could not walk to the corner without the day ending at a hospital. Now the family's story was up on a screen at one of the most important film festivals on Earth, being handed its highest honor, with the brothers themselves walking red carpets and sitting for interviews. Kids who had once been terrified of speaking to a stranger were suddenly in rooms full of them, being celebrated by them. It is a genuinely dizzying leap, and it happened in about the span of time it takes to get through high school. Their mother made the biggest break of all. Suzanne eventually stopped using the Angulo name entirely. She went back to her maiden name, Reisenbichler. She separated from Oscar. She became an advocate for women, and she started writing, working on a memoir and on children's books, telling stories on purpose now, instead of having her story dictated to her. The woman who had been cut off from her own mother for decades became someone who reached outward for the rest of her life. And through everything, it was Suzanne her children stayed close to, the mother who had been trapped right alongside them. They have stayed close to her ever since. And Oscar, the man who held the only key, who decided the city was too dangerous to touch, who sealed 7 children away from the world for years. By the time the film came out, he was the one left behind. His sons were out in the streets he had feared. His wife had taken back her name and reached for her own past. The apartment that had been his entire kingdom, the place where his word was the only law, was slowly emptying out around him, brother by brother, as the children he had kept inside finally chose the door. So let us go back to that door, because that is where this ends. For most of these children's lives, that door was the edge of the entire world. On one side of it, 7 kids and a wall of movies and a father with the only key. On the other side, a city they could hear and see but were not allowed to enter. Oscar believed the locked door was how he kept his children safe. He seemed to think the danger was all out there, in the street, in the crowd, in the city he had decided to hate. But here is the part he never seemed to understand. The movies he used to fill the silence, the ones meant to keep his children busy and content and safely inside, spent all those years quietly showing them everything they were missing and exactly how much they wanted it. Today that door is open. The brothers who once transcribed other people's movies by hand, in pencil, in a locked apartment, now point their own cameras at their own lives. They do not have to rebuild someone else's version of the world anymore, because they finally get to live in the real one. The mask Mukunda wore the first time he walked out was borrowed from a movie, because a movie was all he had. He does not need it now. None of them do. The city that was kept 16 floors below them for all those years turned out to be reachable the whole time. All it ever took was one of them deciding to open the door. If stories like this one pull you in, the ones where the real answer is stranger than the setup, stick around and subscribe, because this channel goes looking for them every week.